Welcome to the Archive for Sexology. Among many other things, we also offer an online curriculum in sexual health. Its 6 courses can be taught in the classroom, but can also be studied at home. I am their author, Erwin Haberle. One of my courses deals with human sexual behavior, including homosexual behavior. Right now, I'd like to add a few observations to this course, and these have to do with social attitudes towards homosexuality and homosexuals over the centuries. I will restrict myself here to our own Western societies, that is Europe and the Americas, which share the same basic sexual values. In the Far Eastern societies, for example China and Japan, the attitudes have been and still are very different. When you look a little more closely at our Western sexual values, you discover that in the course of history they have undergone some very dramatic changes. And a good example of this is the attitude towards homosexuality and homosexuals. Now, before I continue, a note of caution. The subject of homosexuality is too complicated for a short video like this one. Here I can cover only a very limited aspect of it, and even for this I have to resort to an oversimplification. Because, as we sexologists have learned from one of our greatest colleagues, the late Alfred Kinsey, it is wrong to speak of homosexuals as a special, separate group of people. He was able to show in his statistics that homosexuality and heterosexuality are not either-or propositions. They are not matters of black or white, but lie on a continuum. As an illustration, he developed the so-called Kinsey scale. This sliding scale illustrates the fact that there are a great many people, more than half of the population, who in their entire lives never have any homosexual experiences at all. They are listed here under 0. At the other end of the scale, under 6, there is a small number of people with no heterosexual, but only homosexual experiences. And between these opposite ends of the scale, from 1 to 5, we find those who, in the course of their lives, have both heterosexual and homosexual experiences in various degrees. In other words, the scale shows us that homosexuality, like much else in human sexuality, is a matter of degree. Kinsey himself, therefore, refused to use the word homosexual for a person and preferred to speak of homosexual experiences that different people had or did not have in various degrees. And by experiences, he meant not only acts, but also feelings. I could say a lot more about this scale and its uses and abuses in the scientific literature, but this would require a long lecture. Anyway, you can find all necessary details in my course. Right now, as I said, I will oversimplify the matter a bit and talk about it not in scientific, but in popular terms. In everyday language, the word homosexuals is used all the time, and it means people who are known to have engaged in homosexual behavior, never mind how little, how much, or to what degree. Ignoring Kinsey's scale, such people are often called homosexuals by others or even by themselves. And over the centuries, they have provoked very different reactions. Let's start in antiquity. In discussions about homosexuality, you often hear references to ancient Greece. and indeed it is a culture well worth studying in this context. However, I will skip the usual arguments here and mention only one single example of an ancient Greek male couple, Harmodios and Aristogeiton. Again, I have to simplify, but the basic story is this. In the 6th century BC, these famous lovers assassinated a ruling tyrant and thus opened the way for the birth of democracy. The grateful Greeks therefore celebrated them as heroes and role models and erected a monument in their honor. Shown here is a later Roman copy. You see the young Harmodios with his raised sword ready to strike, and the older Aristogeiton at his side. The double statue of these homosexual tyrant killers was meant to be a memorial for all time and a warning to the enemies of democracy. It symbolizes the will of the people to fight for their freedom and to defend it against all forms of dictatorship. Jumping ahead about 2,000 years to the European Middle Ages, we find a complete reversal of attitudes. For one thing, most people now lived under the rule of an hereditary nobility, that is, emperors, kings, and feudal lords. The greatest change, however, was the change of religion. The ancient pagans had been unconcerned when it came to homosexual behavior, but the new religion of Christianity saw in it an abomination and a serious offense against God. Therefore, in the Christian Middle Ages, homosexuals counted among the worst of sinners. They were called Sodomites after the biblical city of Sodom, and they deserved nothing less than the death penalty. The following picture shows the execution of a homosexual couple. This public burning took place outside the city walls of Zurich, Switzerland, in 1482. This is 10 years before Columbus discovered America. So we are talking here about the late Middle Ages. The two condemned were a nobleman, Ritter zu Hohenburg, and his servant. Similar scenes could be seen all over Europe well into early modern times, although the forms of execution varied from place to place. However, the point of these public spectacles was always the same. They were a warning to potential male offenders not to invite the wrath of God by committing the abominable sin of homosexual behavior. In the following centuries, the Christian churches lost much of their former influence, and thus the homosexual offenders gradually turned from sinners into ordinary criminals. The religious aspect of the crime was more and more neglected, and the death penalty was replaced by imprisonment, at least in the English-speaking countries. In France, the Emperor Napoleon I removed homosexual behavior from the criminal code, and as a result, those countries on the European continent that came under Napoleonic influence no longer punished homosexuals at all. The law simply no longer cared. However, this was not the case in Victorian England, as a famous author found out. Oscar Wilde, a very successful married writer and father of 2 sons, had a passionate love affair with a young man, Lord Alfred Douglas. This led to a criminal trial, and when, in the course of this trial, Wilde's other homosexual contacts were exposed, he was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. His wife divorced him, and his sons were brought up under a new family name. After his release from prison, Wilde was a broken man and financially ruined. He died in poverty a few years later in France. The criminal case against Oscar Wilde and his harsh punishment attracted much attention at the time, and many observers began to ask themselves if it was really appropriate in an otherwise modern age. Indeed, eminent psychiatrists demanded an end to such trials, claiming that the defendants were not criminals at all, but rather patients. They were mentally ill and should therefore not go to prison to be punished, but to a hospital to be treated. Indeed, in the following decades, this opinion gained more and more ground, especially in countries where male homosexual contact was still punishable. Unfortunately, this did not help another outstanding British citizen. Alan Turing was a mathematical genius whose work in breaking the Nazi Enigma code was instrumental in defeating the German army in World War II. He was also an important pioneer in the development of computers. Unfortunately, however, in the early 1950s, the police discovered that Turing had a sexual relationship with a young man. With the old law still in effect, he was sentenced to prison. But given the choice of receiving psychiatric treatment instead, this was the progressive twist to the story. He was then treated with female hormones, which of course could not change his sexual orientation, but they had severe side effects. As a result, Turing fell into a deep depression and killed himself. Just as before in the case of Oscar Wilde, the case of the true war hero Alan Turing eventually became an embarrassment to the English legal system. It took many more years, but eventually the system was reformed. As a matter of fact, in time, it became possible to bestow great and very visible honors on the distinguished English male couple. The great 20th century composer Benjamin Britten and his life companion, the tenor Peter Pears, had lived quite openly together for decades and brought well-deserved fame to their country. Thus, the British government honored itself by publicly acknowledging their accomplishments. Here you see a commemorative plaque for Britain and an anniversary stamp for Pears. Yes, there were homosexuals, but now they were also a regular part of the general population. They were simply extraordinary, ordinary citizens. They no longer had to fear imprisonment or forced psychiatric treatment. Even the Church of England accepted them for what they were, great artists and the pride of their country. So, what can we learn from this little history lesson? We can learn at least three things. First, there have always been and there will always be homosexuals in all societies. Second, social attitudes towards homosexuals have been different at different times and in different places. And third, these attitudes can and do change even in the same place. So, let's sum it up. In our Western culture, homosexuals have, in the course of history, been celebrated and honored as heroes, executed as sinners, imprisoned as criminals, medically treated as patients, and finally left alone and accepted as ordinary citizens. Now, draw your own conclusions.